Thank you, Dr. Miles. Just want to thank the Future of Food and Agriculture in Hawaii Speaker Series for partnering with HAPA on this panel. A little background on HAPA, the Hawaii Alliance for Progressive Action. We were actually founded out of the community struggle to protect residents from drift from agrochemical test fields. Specifically, we started on Kauai. Fern Holland, who's a community organizer with us, was very integral in those early days before HAPA was an organization. And I think that's taken us on a journey of trying to basically just get transparency on what pesticides are used in Hawaii, but how we can also ensure that community health is protected and that we're taking common sense, making common sense policy that protects our communities and the environment. And I'm so grateful to be joined by these incredible panelists tonight, and I have the pleasure of getting to work with them in different capacities. So on our far left, we're joined by Dr. Rosana Hernandez Weldon, who is Associate Specialist at Manoa Office of Public Health Studies. Dr. Weldon's research interests and expertise are in exposure assessment and environmental epidemiology of women, children, and reproduction. During her career in public health, she has worked on various large-scale, federally funded studies, primarily Mexican American women and children exposed to pesticides in the Salinas Valley in California. Dr. Weldon is currently working with HAPA to determine potential health effects of pesticides in agricultural communities across Hawaii. Next to Dr. Weldon is Fern Holland, who's a community organizer working with me at HAPA. Ms. Holland is from Kauai originally and has been active in local issues relating to heavy pesticide use, land management, native ecosystem restoration, food sovereignty, and regenerative agriculture locally for over a decade. She received her Bachelor of Science with triple majors in wildlife management, environmental science, and marine biology from Griffith University's School of Environment on the Gold Coast in Australia. Holland was integral in the development and passing of County Bill 2491 on Kauai for disclosure, buffer zones, and protections related to biotech experimental research practices. And she is featured in the award-winning documentary Poisoning Paradise. She has worked for over 15 years on environmental justice issues associated with industrialized agriculture and biotech pesticide and GE experimentation in Hawaii and globally. And last but not least, to my left is Councilmember Keani Rawlins-Fernandez, who represents Molokaʻi on the Maui County Council. Councilmember Rawlins-Fernandez was born and raised on Molokaʻi and grew up in a family intimately connected to Aina. This connection instilled in her the importance of the reciprocal relationship between people and Aina. She is honored to serve the people at Aina of Molokaʻi, Maui, Lanai, and Pohoʻolawe, and is working to ensure that our community's voice is put at the center of decision-making, that our Aina is protected, and that our people are cared for. It is Councilmember Rawlins-Fernandez's life work to protect and serve our islands, our community, and our culture here in Hawaii. Along with being a steward for our Aina, she is also the proud mother of two beautiful, kind, and intelligent children. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. So I think not knowing kind of what everybody's knowledge of pesticides is in the room, we wanted to really start out by just unpacking what are pesticides, how are they classified in terms of toxicity and health risk. So we'll start with Dr. Weldon. We'll start with Fern.
Okay, aloha. So I'm going to break down a little bit of the pesticide general conversation, and then Dr. Weldon will dive into the health effects that she specializes in. So pesticides, are really biocides. Side coming in the Latin word death. They are designed to kill things. So biocides or pesticides are things that kill life. And there's different categories underneath pesticides. And so there's herbicides, which a lot of us are familiar with, that kill plants or weeds. And then we have insecticides, which really target insects. There's also rodenticides, fungicides. We also deal with, and we'll be talking a little bit about fumigants, which are You're not supposed to use nematode. So we'll use worms. They kill worms and other things and sterilize the soil. So that's kind of an overview. So when we talk about pesticides today, we are including herbicides and not. It's all pesticides. And there's two different main categories of pesticides that we deal with. General use pesticides and then restricted use pesticides. And so general use pesticides are those that we can buy right now at Home Depot or Walmart. They include, the very controversial and concerning Roundup, which obviously there's a lot more conversation recently with the lawsuits that have been happening. But those are general use pesticides that you can purchase over the counter at a store. And restricted use pesticides vary from state to state. It depends on the state. Every state has a different list of restricted use pesticides, but those are usually deemed to be very clear in some sort of scientific sense that they're very toxic or have some sort of impacts or restrictions that make them restricted use pesticides. Also here in Hawaii, only restricted use pesticides are recorded and documented and provided in data. So we actually have zero idea about any of the general use pesticides. So a lot of what we'll be discussing tonight is really about restricted use pesticides. And I'm also going to mention just that pesticides, a lot of the conversation and the numbers that we might talk about tonight are talking about the active ingredient within a pesticide formulation. So pesticide formulations are mixed of active ingredients and then a mixture of often different inert ingredients, which can bring their own concerns and issues associated with those ingredients. But today we're really going to be focusing on the active ingredient within a pesticide. I think that's pretty much into this. I'm going to pass it over to Shannon.
Am I on? Okay. Well, regarding the health effects, as Fern mentioned, there's different types of pesticides. So the health effects are going to be sort of in line with what their mode of action is. So if we think of some of the organophosphate or family insecticides, those have a neurotoxicity method of action. And so those have also been associated in humans with neurological effects, neurodevelopmental effects in children. There are many classes of pesticides. There are pyrethroids, there are, as you mentioned, the fumigants for the nematicides. Some of those are associated with birth defects, death. The list is long, but typically when we think of health effects from pesticides, they cover neurological effects, respiratory effects, cardiovascular effects. There also can be endocrine disruption, which means that they interrupt the hormone processes in the body, and that can affect both getting pregnant and delivering at the appropriate time or the appropriate birth weight, and even fetal processes and development. So the other tricky part about health effects of pesticides is that typically people are not just exposed to one, they're exposed to chemical mixtures. And so sometimes it can be hard with humans to separate what might be an actual effect from a particular exposure, because all humans are exposed to a mixture of all kinds of chemicals.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Weldon, for kind of breaking down some of those health risks. Can you share a little bit more with us as well about some of the known public health risks, especially for pesticide exposure in like farm worker populations or other residents that might live in close proximity to heavily sprayed fields?
Well, most of the research that has been done has probably been done in farm worker communities. And in particular, a lot of the data that's out there is regarding poisonings. And so those can have very acute effects, paralysis and memory loss and all sort of neurological effects. Do you want me to mention two others now?
Yeah, no, if you could share a little bit about your research, especially in farm worker communities.
Okay. So I started off my path in public health as part of a group at UC Berkeley that had just started a research project called CHMACOS. That stands for sorry. Felt with us mothers and children of Salinas. And so what they did is in 1999, I'm going to date myself now, they enrolled a group of 601 pregnant women, and they followed them through their pregnancy. They collected all sorts of biological samples, blood and urine and children's shed teeth and cord blood, just hundreds of thousands of samples. They've actually followed these children now for over 20 years, and the children themselves have become part of the community effort to elevate pesticide research throughout the world, really. So some of the findings from that study have been associations between organophosphate pesticides in particular and neurodevelopmental outcomes. They also found associations with shorter gestational age, and there have been over 150 papers. So to summarize it all would take the entire hour, but there is a website, shamambos.org, and then you can find out more information.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will say to some of us worked and Councilmember Rawlins-Fernandez, before she was in elected office, we worked together to pass a bill that was the first for PFAS ban in the U.S. And I have to say I'm so grateful to some of the studies that Dr. Weldon worked on, because we used them heavily in our citations, just to see like this cohort that had been tracked and the really definitive harm to children. So we're really grateful for that research.
That was actually part of my dissertation research that contributed to some of that original ruling, at least in 2015 when Obama, that administration, it was banned. But I was one of the first to show that chlorpyrifos, an organophosphate pesticide, could be detected in mother's milk. And so everybody's saying, well, oh no, it metabolizes so rapidly, you won't find it. But sure enough, it is there. And that is one way that infants are exposed to pesticides, is through their mother's milk.
And I will say that at that time, we didn't have any data or reporting on restricted use pesticides in Hawaii. And so we were looking at really purchase records, sales data, and what we were finding was concerning about the, sometimes what looked like it could be 3 times potentially the chlorpyrifos usage right next to, in particular I'm thinking Hawaiian homesteads in Kekaha on the west side of Hawaii. So Fern, if you can share with us a little bit, since that same bill that banned chlorpyrifos in 2018 also required users of restricted use pesticides, or RUPs, to report on their usage. And the first year of reporting that became available was in 2019, and we spent a lot of time, Fern in particular spent a lot of time analyzing that data. If you could share a little bit with folks about what we learned from that data and what are some of the heaviest used RUPs.
Sure. So again, we're not talking about general use pesticides. So in this calculation, we're not talking about all the Roundup that's used. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about just the restricted use pesticides that were reported through Act 45. And for me, I have been working for over 10 years since moving off from university on Kauai, very concerned about West Side Kauai, having, at the time, probably one of the largest research experimental test field sites anywhere in the world for biotechnology. And, really focusing on the concerning stuff around West Side Kauai. And then when we got this first round of data, it became really apparent that we had a serious problem in Central Oʻahu. And it immediately kind of pivoted a lot of, my work and effort into well, what are we going to do about this? And one of the things that we learned collectively was that Oʻahu had reported out in 2019 over 280,000 pounds of active ingredient within the formulation in that single year. And the bulk of that, over 216,000, about 108 tons, mixed up of 23 different restricted use pesticides, was applied to Central Oʻahu in the northern part of Central Oʻahu, basically north of Mililani. And immediately it was like this dwarfing of everything else. Everything else kind of went down on the graph, and there was just this huge use in North Central Oʻahu. So that really kind of started to target into, the bulk of that. What is that? What's being used? We have these mixtures of about 23 different active ingredients. And what we found is about 170,000 pounds of that, about 88 tons, was a fumigant called 1,3-D or 1,3-dichloropropene, which is commonly called Telone as a product name. And then another over 30,000 pounds a metamosodium, which is another fumigant. And so combined, his two fumigants exceeded 200,000 pounds in a single year. While we haven't fully mapped and analyzed the 2020 and 2021 data yet, it was actually really, really hard to analyze because it was produced in all these different ways, and it was uncomparable. We had to do so much transcribing to get to the point where we could actually compare apples to apples, so to speak. We really realized that this huge amount of fumigant dwarfed everything else and was a serious concern. And again, to follow up with Sana mentioned briefly, with the overlap of these combinations of mixtures that have never been studied, right? So, we have these 23 different restricted use pesticides, including these two massive fumigant uses, and we have no idea what those. Every time you mix a chemical, because no chemicals have ever been tested in combination, when you start to overlap, and there's now 23 different pesticides, being used, plus all the other things that we're dealing with in the community, all the other general use pesticides, jet fuel, all the different things that we've had to deal with in our water, in our environment. We have no idea how these things combine in the natural world, and then if they create stronger impacts or weaker impacts, depending on all that. And one of the things that we learned when we looked, throughout the islands at the totals and what's being used on each island, obviously Oʻahu just dwarfed everything because of this heavy fumigant use. But only 10 entities were using 99% of all the reported restricted use pesticides in all of Hawaii. So 10 entities. And of that, the top 5 entities were using 97% of all the restricted use pesticides. And so the current rates of pesticides, they vary obviously from place to place, but one of the things that was really shocking is that it really is only a handful of users that are using literally all of this stuff. So, these aren't small-scale farmers, these aren't your everyday backyard farmer, these aren't, ranchers, these aren't property owners that are reporting this use. 99% was coming from the top 10 entities, of which only 5 actually even produce food at all. So that was probably some of the most shocking. I tried to make a few notes here because there was a lot of information, but.
And I did want to mention just in particular those two fumigants, they do have associated health effects, particularly cancer and respiratory effects are a concern, but also this, mentioned sodium is associated with that birth effects and the fetal death. So they have real health effects.
And also, can you share a little bit about the fumigants and other, and are they prone to drift, or are they, can you share that bit?
Well, definitely the fumigants are highly prone to drift because they're applied as a gaseous form. So depending on each pesticide has a different fate in the environment, right? So some of these end up in the groundwater because they percolate through our soil and they end up in the deep water. Some of them run off, and end up in our surface water. Some of them are attached to sediment and kind of either settle in the bottom of streams or even attach and bind to the soil. And in the case of the fumigants, they're extremely volatile and they're actually sprayed as a gas. So often they're shot into the soil to sterilize and basically kill off the living, life in the soil. And in those cases, they've found talone or 1,3-D as far as 7 miles away from application. So, and impacts as far as 7 miles away. And some of the stuff with talone, it'll actually, because it's got a bit of a heavier molecular weight than the oxygen in the atmosphere, it'll actually settle into garages, and if the winds are still, it won't move fast enough, right? So I think corners into a building, it could actually settle and stay within the lower atmosphere for longer than you'd expect.
Hey, Ms. Fern, and can you share a little bit about also what crops are used on, the heavier pesticides we're seeing used most frequently?
Yeah, so the crops particularly associated with this heavy fumigant use is pineapple. Actually, the only 2 users of pineapple, or the only 2 users of talone are growing pineapple. And we've had a long history of toxins associated with pineapple, all the way back to when we fed our cows pineapple tops and poisoned our own milk years ago. But pineapple is definitely one for ED for sure. And then we're seeing mixed large-scale commercial food crops being some of the other mixed use applications, and where we're seeing the metasodium. So I'm not totally clear 100% of which crop is happening, is being utilized with the metasodium, but really, and there are some ornamentals that we're seeing come up, certain places that are using ornamentals. And we're seeing, we have this other big elephant in the room, is that we have these large biotech corporations, right? Syngenta, Dow Chemical Corporation, historically Monsanto, now Bayer. And we are this experimental year-round place that has year-round growing conditions. So these people have come in and they've established, these corporations, not people, have come in and established their experimental operations here. And because of that, we don't have a down season, we have no winter, right? So there's no period where all the bugs die and everything kind of dies off. They can spray year round. And so we're not totally sure. There's a lot of unanswered questions and possible exemptions for the biotech corporations. So these numbers, unfortunately, might actually be a lot less than they are being reported out as, because the biotech chemical companies have certain exemptions under the FIFRA federal pesticide law that have allowed them to basically do this experimental field trials, they get experimental research permits. And so we're not totally sure that all of that experimental research stuff is being reported out accurately or at all. And in that case, it's actually corn, it's experimental biotechnology. So in those cases, it's genetically engineered crops that have either been genetically engineered to produce a pesticide, so the bug flies in and eats the plant, and the bug dies because every cell in the plant is producing that pesticide, or they're genetically engineered to withstand herbicide application. So being the open air field trial site for these GMOs, they plant the crops and then they test how much dicamba, for example, just using any herbicide as an example, can we spray on this before the plant dies? And then that's how they gene build this tolerance trait, right? So some of it's that. But I think the big elephant in the room is that this isn't a small-scale regenerative farmers that this is happening. These are, industrialized agriculture model. It's ideas of these large monocrops, where we see entire landscapes. And what historically we've dealt with here as a place that's overcome from plantation, we've seen entire monocrop agricultural systems based upon this one crop thing that results in needing heavy input use, whereas we're learning more and more every year that the mixing of plants in a way that's more ecologically sound and increases biodiversity and increases assemblage of different species actually makes things naturally more robust to where you don't need these pesticides like this. So yeah, it's while there's individual crops, the real big zoom out is the fact that this is really about monocrop industrialized agriculture, and that you're not seeing this in regenerative, small scale, or even a lot of food production agriculture.
Annie, can I just mention something about the deer really quickly? So Fern summarized that beautifully. What she didn't tell you is the backstory to how you can get all of those amazing figures. It's not that easy to go from, yes, Hawaii has required reporting for restricted use pesticides, and that is amazing in and of itself. But to get to the point where you can summarize the data, I have a student here who knows exactly what I'm talking about, is very painful. Many sheets to go through, much data translation, and there's conversions so that you can all be on the same units, and whether you choose gallons or pounds or whatever. And then just cleaning the data and making sure that it makes sense is very time consuming and a very big production.
Yeah, in the first year of reporting for 2019, which we analyzed here, it took us years to get to this point, but it was literally chicken scraps. Some of it was handwritten on the forms, not even in English. And then it was all different units. And so you have to transcribe everything into one unit before you can compare it, as we've got, everything to imagine. So thank you, that's a good point.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Center for Food Safety also really helped a lot on that first year of 2019 data. Shifting gears a little bit, so we know that there's collateral damage that comes along with living adjacent to heavily sprayed fields, and there have been communities that have historically been exposed, and then communities now that we're learning from this new data, we didn't realize were exposed. So I'm wondering if we can start with Councilmember Rawlins-Fernandez to share a little bit about, maybe let it start from a historic perspective of some of the communities that, I know your community in Molokaʻi had a lot of GE fields, and also the west side of Hawiʻi, and areas on Maui and the North Shore of Oʻahu. But if you can maybe share a little bit historically some of the impacts that we see with exposure and just having these operations close by our schools in Hawaii.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to get my heart rate under control. Just hearing all that information, I don't know how more policymakers don't experience the same thing, that same outrage of like, how are we allowing this to continue happening in Hawaii? So on Molokaʻi, so similar to Hawaii, the Monsanto fields and Mycogen, which was a subsidiary of Dow, their fields were owned in Poʻolehua, and if you're familiar with Molokaʻi, Poʻolehua is where the second homestead in Hawaii is. So it's a large area of farming, but all, HAPA, it's all homestead. In the center of the fields where they do open air experiments, there's the Molokaʻi irrigation system, which is a 1.4 billion gallon reservoir, open reservoir, where, as you heard, the drift can go right over and into the water source, and that water used to go to the communities on the west end. So all the homesteaders in central Molokaʻi and Poʻolehua, all the way to Manoa, which was a plantation town, so a lot of affordable housing, so low and moderate income communities. And across from the fields are our schools. So we have an elementary school, our middle school, and our high school. And at Oʻahu Elementary School is the only immersion school program on our island. And so a lot of our Hawaiian speaking children are all at Oʻahu School, all within distance of potential drift, pesticide drift. And so when you talk about like who are some of these people who are being directly impacted, I mean, I think that some of these corporations would consider these communities pests as well. Especially as we rise up to demand safer environments for our children, and that they shouldn't be spraying or doing open field testing.
Farm workers, across the world, on the United States, a lot of them are, often undocumented workers, and many Mexican families, living in close proximity to farmers. Here in Hawaii, we also see that. We see, transit workers, people that are brought in. We've had cases where the Filipino workers that have been brought in from the Philippines were poisoned and then sent home. There's quite a few cases like that. What we're finding when we map this stuff is that this is not happening in affluent college communities, and this is happening in, lower socioeconomic populations of, local, multi-generational alleys. We're finding that but we see it what is known about the impacts of pesticide use in Hawaii other frontline communities. It's actually very little, because there really has not been research in this way. And as crazy as it sounds, our population is not a high enough number to even get statistical significance in a lot of cases. So we really don't know the specific, epidemiological connections. And we have to be very careful because correlation is not causation, right? And so we need to, it's hard to give those, from a scientific perspective, it's hard to give that. We know that communities, when they start, they have complained about everything from headaches to nosebleeds. I just had some families in Waniwa say that, they moved to Waniwa and now her and her husband get nosebleeds all the time. And they never had nosebleeds before in their life. And they have been going to the doctor. The doctor's like, oh, we don't know. And there's been concerns I'll just share, for me, coming home, leaving Oldham University with a few years of this research under my belt about pollution chemistry
interest and major. I came home like, you know, and I actually, the year, 10 years ago when we passed Bill 2491, I had 3 friends who all conceived babies with a birth defect called gastroparesis. And, you know, one of them aborted the baby because it didn't have a lot of chance of survival. One of them miscarried. And the other, my nephew Errol, was born with his intestines outside of his body. And, sorry, it's still traumatic for me 10 years later, but 6 months of open gut surgeries, slowly put his intestines back inside of his body. Praise God, he has a great life now and a little sister. But it was traumatic because I came home to my community that I was born and raised in, and doctors on the west side of Hawaii were saying, hey, we have like possibly up to 10 times the national average of these diseases, you know, holes in the heart, intestinal deformities at birth. And it was like, you know, like we call for help. I remember calling EPA in tears, like I have right now. I'm so emotionally happy. I think I get better at this. But and calling the EPA like in tears, like saying like, send help, like nobody's listening, you know. And you know, my friend at the west side of Hawaii like would talk about how like the entire street, like 26 different reports of cancer on a tiny little street, our tiny little community. And when I talked to my friend at the time at MIT, he's like super intelligent, like was doing all this like math. I don't even know what kind of degree he's doing math, but some kind of degree in math. And he calculated, you know, by 3 gastroparesis cases, analyzing Kauai as a population of the whole island. And mind you, this is all in the same section, which we believe had very heavy levels of atrazine in the groundwater, right? So yeah, he said it was like 1 in like some ridiculous number of like 300 million chance that one community of the size of about 60,000 people, which is roughly what Kauai was, could actually have 3 people develop that disease within the same period of time. And so, you know, while we don't know, Keani and I have, you know, seen, you know, our schools evacuate. We've seen, you know, the battles that occur, the people that come to, you know, like our dear friend, our mutual friend that lives in Waimea, you know, for tested her daughter's hair and found like 14 different types of pesticides in her kid's hair, and lived across the street from the Syngenta test fields. You know, it's, you know, while we don't have the kind of silos that a lot of scientists and policymakers want to see, we have communities that have lived through this and experienced this. And yeah.
I thought, I know why you're emotional about it. It's because you're reliving that trauma. Because when we're in it and you see the impacts, and we're living the impacts, it's traumatic. And then to not have enough people, leaders, do something about it. It's so frustrating. To bring all this evidence and to not have the response that you would expect from the government to protect the health of our people and to protect the health of our island. That's why it's emotional. But I also wanted to clarify, because we said an important point, and I just want to make sure that everyone understood that when we said that immigrant farm workers are sent home, they're sent back to their country. And so they become harder to track. When they're sent back, then if you know, their impact is, their health is impacting, they're not back in their own countries, and they don't have the kind of, you know, rights that, you know, citizens have. They're you know, immigrants, and then they're sent back before you know, corporations, you know, before symptoms, you know, show themselves and begin in trouble.
That only is one of the major issues with pesticide exposures, is that there's a lag time before health effects emerge. And so you're right, you're not in the community anymore, you're not going to see anybody else affected.
Thank you for that. This is the next question is for both Fern and Councilmember Rawlins-Fernandez. Can you share about whose kuleana it is to monitor pesticide use and the regulation of pesticides in Hawaii? And either of you guys can start.
Okay. So the government, particularly the state, you know, like had the kuleana to
regulate, monitor, enforce policies that ensure the protection of the health of our communities. And so when activities occur in the community, whether it's individuals or, corporations, entities, when those activities start to infringe upon others' rights to be free from harm, it's the government's responsibility to step in. And when it doesn't, then the people organize, and that's what happened in 2014. It's probably before then too, as the organizing, but in 2014 is when the communities reorganized, and on Kauai, they went through the council, through the to add on it. So Bill and all that firms speak to that. But in Maui County, the process that our community went through was ballot initiatives, and that is to add or to amend the charter to add, the protection that wasn't happening from the council. And so the community, so in our charter, which is a county's constitution, we have a ballot initiative. So if the community is able to get 20% of signatures, so 20% of the electorate to sign on to a petition to add a question on the ballot that would amend the charter to add this protection, then it'll be ratified in the election process, and it'll be added to the charter. And so, I mean, it amazingly historically was successful, and through that work, it was now law, and the council and the administration at that time refused to enforce that law. And Dana, so I were going to go big paragraphs on it, but I think your question was, whose responsibility is it to so I'll stop there for now, and then perhaps I'll talk more about what happened. Yeah, so whose responsibility is it? It does fall on technically the federal and state government. I mean, for me, it was all levels of government. So when we fought for 2481 and passed Bill 2481 in Hawaii, our bill gave us full disclosure. It wasn't a radical bill. It was a very common sense measure. It was full disclosure, what's being tested, what pesticides are being used, where, when, and it was a back off of communities. So it was a 500-foot buffer zone around schools, homes, and hospitals. And the initial version of our bill was actually incredibly bold because it asked for an environmental impact assessment of the industry. And it asked for an environmental impact assessment of the collective weight of these 4 chemical corporations. We had 4 out of the 5 at the time. They've all changed names, so I'm not into that. But and then what happened, and I'll just touch on the court case to follow up with Keani. So in 2013, we passed Bill 2481. In 2014, and you forgot the key thing about you guys passed that bill like half a point. The Maui miracle, it was like it wanted it out. Well, the charter bill, it was 0.5%. They had enough votes. It was like almost that. So, and it was written tricky. And it turned out like one sound to it ended up putting so much money in Maui. What was it, like $800 a vote? It was like quite crazy. Yeah. So they won by 0.5% on the ballot. It was like incredible. We called it the Maui Miracle. And then right after that, Hawaiʻi Island passed Ordinance 113, which actually outright banned genetically engineered testing on Hawaiʻi Island. Hawaiʻi Island don't want this problem. They don't have any of that. So we were then taken, immediately we were sued. Kauai County was sued by the largest chemical corporation in the world, Syngenta. They sued our county, and we went into this long court battle, right? And so we lost in the 9th Circuit federal court, where they ruled that because the state constitution does not give the counties
the clear authority to regulate pesticides, the judge decided that we should assume that they don't have that right. So even though we are given the authority to regulate things that impact public life, health, or property, I mean, clearly this does, but we should be implied as preempted, which is the absolute craziest thing I've heard. And that's where it came back to the state, and that's where we divided our energy and started really focusing at the state capitol to try to get any of these measures. You know, and here we are 10 years later, and I'm still sitting here, and I'm still fighting for disclosure, like accurate, good quality reporting. But it really comes down to the Department of Agriculture, and you know, really, the way that it's set up, a lot of that falls on our DOA and the state government, because really, the federal government has been largely, you know, complacent in unfortunately, the way that it works in the United States compared to Europe is not, the United States does not practice the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is basically like the idea of like proving something is safe before you mass use it. Whereas in America, we like allow corporations to dictate and they use whatever they like use until there's enough scientific evidence to prove without a doubt that it causes harm, at which point we then retract things. But at first, it's like kick open the door to what you like, only until there's enough evidence to show without a doubt that harm to life, health, or the environment has happened. And then that's why it takes us 20, 30 years if we're fighting individual pesticides to get those pesticides right. It took us like 40 years to ban DDT. Whereas in the European Union and Europe and throughout a lot of other places in the world, they have a more precautionary approach where you have to do a lot more testing. Where here, the corporations, they do their own studies, they do their own checks, they send it back to the EPA for checks, but really they're providing the evidence that says, oh, this stuff is safe. And this is where, you know, slight derail, but this is where the glyphosate lawsuits are coming in, as if they've proven without a doubt that they actually hit all that science and they hit the stuff that showed the links between glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so you're seeing, like, historically, the federal government really allows for a ridiculous amounts of tapes to be utilized before there's any safety measures that are really tested. You know, they'll say that there's safety stuff, but there's never the deep level of like environmental checks of ecological impact and like the long-term studies. And so unfortunately that falls on the states. That falls on the states because of the utter negligence of the federal government to really have a strong EPA, have a strong FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticides, Rodenticides, Fungicides Act. Yeah, so that's how I agree. How's that question?
You reminded me that I did just say what charm and it was. And so in Maui County, that charter amendment was to place a moratorium on pesticide use, genetically engineered activity until it was proven safe. And that was part of the case that Fern talked about. And I also wanted to clarify that, you know, ultimately it's the people's responsibility to ensure that we're, you know, safe. And the state doesn't have a ballot initiative process. Only the delegates do, unfortunately. And so when the state was failing our communities to keep us safe, the people stepped in through a process at the county level to keep our children safe.
And I'll just add that, you know, now that the courts have determined that it is the state's responsibility, it's also lawmakers' responsibility to appropriately fund the Department of Agriculture to do that work. And what people may not realize is our Department of Agriculture, I think, is 0.6%. Dexter, correct me if it's like 0.3%, 0.03% of the state's budget. So if we want to see more robust, you know, deterrents to this kind of use, that would be incentivizing, you know, conventional farmers to transition. You know, some of these, maybe not the industry that makes its profit from pesticide sales, but so that really is also incumbent on our state lawmakers to appropriately fund the agency to do that work. But we don't have to throw our friends at the DOA under the bus because we have actually a really great DOA right now. Yeah, it was a different story, but anyhow. So I think we kind of touched a little bit on, I think you get a sense from the court cases, how the industry responded to some of the community concerns. I'm going to move us on to the next question, which is really about what are some of the systemic solutions that we can look at. And I'm going to ask Fern first to maybe talk a little bit about some of the systemic solutions, maybe at the state level, but also in our systems of agriculture. And Councilmember Rawlins-Fernandez to talk a little bit about what some of the really tangible things that Maui County is already doing. So Fern, maybe start us on.
Thank you. This is the one I did take some notes because I want to be thoughtful about this one. The biggest systemic solution is transforming our agricultural sector. Transforming our ag sector to be one that's based around and supporting regenerative agroecological models. A system that learns and embraces the surrounding environment, the watersheds, and the ancient wetlands and indigenous agricultural model that was so successful in Hawaii. That's the big picture, is like, how do we transform this full agricultural system to not be this monocrop dependent industrialized model, right? We need to stop leasing our public lands for experimental biotech research and the growing of genetically engineered crops and the use of heavy duty pesticides. And we really need to get down and work with the food producers and the farmers to transition away from this 100-year-old plus brainwashing of chemical dependency by biotech chemical corporations that have made billions and billions and billions of dollars selling us their pesticides. Really these chemical corporations, they are from the early turn of the century, the 1900s. A lot of these chemical corporations got their footholds in Europe with the creation of the gases that killed the Jewish people during the Holocaust. I mean, these nerve gases that were used to gas people during the Holocaust were then transitioned post the war into pesticides and sold to our people for agriculture and moved into this whole sector. And I think, we need to help our farmers undo and unpack that. So to get back to and to learn how to survive without these things that we've been sold this lie of chemical dependency. Outside of food, outside of, the systemic solutions around agriculture, like, we need to address our entire way that we manage land, the entire connection that we have to our IDA, the entire way that we think about how we manage and treat land. We need to come up with lasting solutions that deal with the widespread invasive species problem that we have that doesn't depend on a continually constant targeting and non-target impacts, poisoning, and move toward like a sustainable, holistic land management model that really deals with these in a way where we create a sustainable system that we can deal with without this use of chemical dependency. I mean, those are the systemic, fundamental, big picture stuff that I'll chime in on it. Let me know if I'm missing anything.
You could just add some of the bills that'll be people can support this session.
Okay, I have that on the other one. But yeah, so, as creative as it is for me, and it's sometimes like head-bangingly frustrating to be up here 10 years after we passed Bill 2491, after I had thousands of people march through the streets with us. Thousands. We shut down Poipu Road. We shut down Rice Street. We passed this bill at 3 a.m. and this those incredible marathon hearings. Only to have our mayor veto the bill, only to then override the mayoral veto by one vote in this incredible. Okay, now it was like win, lose, and then get sued in federal court, and then have all of our bills across the islands overturned. To go back to a state government that's been lobbied by chemical corporations year after year after year after year. When you look at the amount of money that they dumped into our legislature and how much they give to representatives, and there's a handful of people, and a lot of them aren't still in that building, so I'm not going to blast names, but there's a handful of people that gridlocked and blocked every single measure that we made. And here I am 10 years later, sitting here, and I'm about to say, we need disclosure. We need proper reporting. We need complete reporting and disclosure. What's being used, sprayed, where, when. We can't make any good decisions without really knowing the situation. So improving our restricted use pesticide, on the back of the flyer that's available at the front door, we have 3 of our key legislative priorities. We have more, but we have these 3 priorities, and the first one is really getting that restricted use pesticide data to come in a way that is usable, that is accurate, that is overseen and right, but also that's geospatially located. And we need within a mile accuracy to really be able to do epidemiological studies or public health studies to look at the impacts. And right now, our reporting is by TMK. And so in the case of the west side of Kauai, the TMK is 13,000 acres. So we have no idea where are those 13,000 acres, these 1,500 applications in a year that were reported on this TMK, 1,500 applications of just restricted use pesticides. Where are those 1,500 applications happening? We have no idea. It could be anywhere from Polihale on the far west side, all the way to, will they actually voluntarily, after, 2491 and we marched in the streets, they did voluntarily back out our schools a little bit on Kauai. But the reality is that there's this unknown, right? And so to really have accurate numbers and to really have an idea what's going on, we have to have good reporting, and we have to have a system where, it shouldn't take us multiple years to transcribe and map. I mean, our small little nonprofit organization is doing this work, and it should be, it should be accessible to the public. It should be able to be done. So we're totally, looking at how do we get better reporting is just our first effort. And then, we're looking at buffer zones. I continue to fight for buffer zones. California has a 1/4 mile for all the schools. We're working on a bill for a 1/2 mile around schools. We would then lead the nation in the strongest buffers for school system anywhere. And with the kind of winds that we have in Hawaiʻi, that's not inappropriate, And so we're pushing for buffer zones, and we'll continue to do that. We're also working on neonicotinoids, which are the newest, largest, biggest class of insecticides that are really used globally. And because they're not registered as restricted use pesticides in Hawaiʻi, we have no idea how much is being used. We have no idea. There's no recording. There's no reporting back on neonic use. And so we just it's disclosure again, but it's listing neonicotinoids, the whole class of insecticides, as a restricted use pesticide so that we can start to gather information. How much is being used? Where is this stuff happening? Because the FIFRA federal legislation exempts seed coating, so the new thing now is that, and just to explain a little bit about what neonics are, neonicotinoid or neonics are systemic pesticides. They're often coating the seed when the seed is planted, right? So you'll see these crazy seeds are like bright neon pink and like this crazy like aqua blue, right? But they're coated in insecticide. They plant the seed in the ground, and then as the plant grows, it takes up with the root, with the plant, it takes up this insecticide, and it's then exhibited throughout the plant, the biology of the plant. It becomes like inside the plant. It's incredible that we figure out ways to do this stuff. I mean, it's mind-blowing. But so now the bug flies in and it eats the leaves of the corn, and it dies because the systemic pesticide's been brought up into it. But because the seed coating is exempted under the federal legislation, it's not even considered a pesticide. So there's these crazy loopholes in the federal government and have allowed zero idea. We have zero idea, despite it being the most heavily used class of insecticides, we have no idea how much it's being used. So our ask for this legislative session is to, have a bill that has neonicotinoids registered as restricted use pesticides. And we've had to dance around a few things, like the industry that treats wood, fought back because they use neonics. So, we're working now to exempt a certain industry that is using it on one type treatments, like oftentimes house tenting these days will now be neonic pesticides. We're looking at the larger, widespread use, but we still want to know, we need the reporting of what's happening, where is this stuff being used, right? And so that's the third main measure that we're pressing on the flyer. There's some other ones, we're trying to get malathion. There was a spill of malathion here on Oʻahu. Community has gone sick. We're trying to get that one listed as a restricted use pesticide because that would stop it from being able to be purchased at the store, right? And then there's a few other stuff as well. I'd be amiss if I didn't honor Representative Caruso, who was here and actually introduced a lot of these bills for us year after year.
Systemic solutions. Okay, so in 2014, after the win and lose that the communities experienced,
It inspired I think it was like over 24,000 people who signed that petition to the ballot initiative. And when the council members refused to enforce the law that the people have passed, Uncle Alika Tai, helped to spearhead the effort of putting together a slate of candidates. And so, it's wonderful to have good legislation being introduced. It's hard when you know that it's going to go into a committee that will eat its death because who donated to their campaigns. Who has their ears. And so in 2016, we ran a slate of candidates that were going to center the community's effort to protect our community from pesticides and the GMO practice, farming practices. And at the time, I believe we got three of our candidates in. And then the following election year, we got a majority most of the time. But we had 5 of the 9, but one wasn't as solid as we had thought. And then in the following year, we're not as solid. 5, sometimes 6, so sometimes we even had a supermajority. And so if we could enact that kind of representation in the state legislature, we could get Department of Ag and or some of you being and pass some of the these like just common sense legislation to protect our people. And so after we got council members that were committed to doing work that fall directly under our jurisdiction, some of the things that we've done is we ban pesticide use on all county-owned and managed land. That was the big one.
You're in the United States. That is the strongest land management county regulation anywhere in the United States.
That's fantastic. Autoblast and beyond pesticides for helping us with that. That was a battle. The departments, like Fern's saying, it was the chemical dependency, right? So the weed management along the roadside, that's county managed land, county, the easements. We have parks where our see, we put in at least about $2 million every year into our county budget to grant up to $25,000 to our small farmers so that they can invest in that kind of equipment.
It's a good one to have that and it's just such a testament to what you're saying about political will is if we have people in elected positions who see this as viable and realistic and are willing to champion it, it is possible. So thank you for being that change in your county. And before we transition into the Q&A, I just had one more question for Dr. Weldon about anyone who might be here or watching online who may be concerned that they're exposed. Are there some really practical things that they can do to protect themselves and their families?
Absolutely. So for the general population, I'd say the most likely route of exposure would be ingestion. So the things that you are eating. And one way that you can help protect yourself is honestly to support organic farmers and buy organic food. Now, I understand it can be expensive. It can be challenging. Sometimes there are real life food deserts where there's hardly any produce to choose from to begin with. So if it is absolutely not an option, washing your fruits and vegetables, your produce in general, will help. The Environmental Working Group puts out an amazing list of, they call it the Dirty Dozen. and it's a list of the 12 hops that have the highest pesticide residues on them. Now, for the dirty dozen, you should probably understand that they actually do wash and peel. They do their testing in the food and as we would eat it. And so those are going to remain the dirty dozen whether you wash them or not. But still, if you're not washing your food, your potential exposure is going to be higher. Now, there are different things to consider for farm worker populations that are people who reside near farms. You would want to really pay attention to things like, if you're a farm worker, you do not want to wear your clothing that you wore at work into your home. You want to make sure you take that off. You want to make sure you launder it separately from your family's laundry. You want to make sure that you take your shoes off, and that's even if you live near the fields. Take your shoes off before you enter the home. We try to keep your surfaces clean. In particular, children are vulnerable to pesticide exposures. They're more likely to have health effects, and so they also have behaviors, hand-to-mouth behaviors. They'll crawl around on the floor, they're putting things in their mouths, and so they have more ways to be exposed. So we want to protect the children in particular. That's without call.
And lunch, and I guess with that, we can go ahead and open the Q&A portion at the top.
All right, so we collected a series of questions from the audience, and I want to get the opportunity to read these questions. The first is, first in appreciation, thank you so much for the panelists and organizers for your work putting this event together. The key question is, it was mentioned that there were 5 primary pesticide applicators here on Oahu. What were those top 5 entities that are responsible for the majority of pesticide application on this island?
Dole is utilizing 1,3-D. So Dole was responsible for 178,000 pounds of 1,3-D to loan use just in 2019. It looks from the summary numbers like we're talking about 200,000 pounds a year from Dole alone. And that's just one of the RUPs that they use. But that one, outweighs a lot. Sugarland Farms is adjacent to Dole. They're the ones using that 30,000 pounds of metasodium. That is immediately adjacent to Dole. And so despite them being separate TMKs and separate users, it's really all happening in that one space between Wahiawa and Waialua. So, a huge amount of use is those 2 users right there. Surrounding also being a Hartung, which used to be Syngenta. They've all changed names in the 10 years I've been fighting with my own. And Corteva, which is actually a subsidiary of Dow Chemical Corporation. Dow Chemical Corporation makes 1,3-D. That's their product. So Dow Chemical is now in Hawaii, it's Corteva. They purchased Pioneer, which was DuPont, but DuPont and Dow merged to create Dow DuPont, and then they now operate in Hawaii under Corteva. We see, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head here, the other user of 1,3-D is the only other larger pineapple producer, Hawiʻi in upcountry Maui. There was a loon farms being next in line, pretty much trying to go out in the line in order. I think off the top of my head, those are the only top that are in my phone. But those would be the top 5, Bobby.
Okay, thank you. Next question would be, how do these chemical corporations influence the state political process?
Oh, the joys. With a lot of money. A very lot of money. I've actually analyzed some of our state senators and representatives that have historically, for many, many years, been in their positions, looking at how much donations are received from Monsanto, which now is Bayer, over the years, and the chemical corporations combined, and their lobbyists, they pay a lot of money on all levels of government. Actually, if you watch the documentary that I've helped make for years called Poisoning Paradise, which follows, our work on Hawaii with Bill 2491, the court case and all that, we actually have a section where we go through and show how much money on the federal level was donated to the senators and reps on the federal level, and it's just absolutely astonishing.
They also have a lot of propaganda. So money, propaganda, fear, they use it all.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, Hawaii successfully banned chlorpyrifos several years ago. Why was that initiative successful? Was it the magnitude of the scientific literature that was available to make the argument? What made that effort successful relative to some other high-risk restricted use pesticides?
Sana's work.
And not just mine, there are other studies. Right? There were several other studies that corroborated the findings. So even though you cannot show causation, when you have this, the weight of the evidence is all pointing in the same direction, it's profound.
Yeah, I think the truth is that so many different, like again, we don't process things in this precautionary principle. We allow for chemicals to be used until there's, without a doubt, enough evidence that shows that you can't deny it anymore. This chemical is causing these effects, and that's what you're starting to see with Roundup. You're starting to see the lawsuit with Lee Johnson that really showed that they had hidden all this stuff. Fabulous movie, Into the Weeds, just became available. It's incredible documentary. Everybody should watch Into the Weeds. Fabulous documentary, but it follows the court cases of like how they proved without a doubt that these corporations have lied, outright hidden. It's emails back and forth joking about it, hiding the links between that and Parkinson's disease. And it takes so long to develop statistically significant studies that can prove without a doubt, okay, this is definitely doing this. And so that's why, chlorpyrifos was possible, because the amount of literally 20 years, they had to follow these kids for 20 years where they're like, oh, yep, there's neurological impacts that have happened throughout these people's lives, And I think that's comes back to the crux of the problem, is that we're waiting for that science. And so I would say that the undeniable science and the work of, like people like Keani and I that are showing up at the Capitol and just, we're up against these huge lobbying pressures and the largest chemical corporations in the world, like some of the most powerful corporations on earth. And we're, community members of like environmental scientists that moved home and wanted to help their community, like, mothers. And so we showing up, creating the organization around getting people to testify, like encouraging people like you guys to write letters and talk to your senators and show up. It's a lot of work. And so that work, combined with the absolute undeniable clear science that people like Sunny helped to develop, made it possible.
And even when there is good science, the political process can still interfere, as we've seen on the federal level with chlorpyrifos.
Yeah, and so, as Fern is saying, a lot of different organizations that, the politicians couldn't just dismiss as radical, right? So we had the nursing organizations, pediatrics, the teachers. So, we had a lot of the community groups coming out that year, and it was undeniable, pressure. And then, there's also, the media. The media isn't always friendly to this topic. And, like when I first ran for office, the media, despite all of my, accomplishments, experience, degrees. I have a law degree and an MBA, and they, boiled it down to me being a single issue head, which was, and in either the headlines that they would make it was anti-GMO, anti-pesticide against, pro-GMO candidates. So I think, the media often, has a hand in either helping or definite.
Thank you. The next question I'll pose is, what are the bills coming before the 2024 legislative session that we should all be aware of and potentially track, weigh in on, that relate to this topic?
So just again, I'll repeat the RUP reporting bill that we will be continuing. It's actually, so we're in this weird biannual year where the bills that weren't properly killed last year are actually still alive. So we're going to be pulling back at some of those that we already have active. One of them being the RUP reporting, better reporting for RUPs. the neonates being registered as restricted use pesticides, the buffer zone bills where we're trying to challenge Hawaii to look even beyond what California has, the malathion being listed as RUPs. There's also 2 coming down in the administrative package that the governor is supporting, transitioning the advisory council of pesticides or the advisory board for pesticides away from pineapple and sugar to put more farmers in. And then there was the one other one next to you, right? What it was? One other one. No, okay. Dead. So that's the one other bill I'm talking about, the admin packet, which is like a no-brainer. I think those are our strongest ones. There's also a ton of awesome solution-based bills that we keep supporting. Everything from restoring multi-video fish pond systems, like we're restoring our agricultural native ways, our food production, supporting small-scale farmers, tax breaks for organic farmers. Like there's going to be a whole swath because of the incredible organizations that we're collaborating with to create real solution-based bills as well. Those are my pesticide priorities, but really got some great agricultural priorities to support agriculture or positive light as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, are there other state models that have similar climates? I'm not sure how relevant that is, but are there other state models that have successfully managed to regulate pesticides, and what could we learn from them? California has been referred to repeatedly. So what do we have essentially in terms of a pesticide regulation and monitoring apparatus relative to, say, California? What can we learn from the California model?
California is a really big state with a really big population and a lot of money. So it's really not a fair comparison necessarily to try to apply everything that California is doing here. I hope you agree with me, but I'm not trying to say that our goal should be to transplant what California has. We can learn a lot from California. We can look at some of the research that comes out of California, and we can, they have a huge California Department of Pesticide Regulation that's enormous. Very
well funded.
They're very well funded. They do have a wonderful pesticide use reporting system. And so and their data are geolocated down to 1 square mile, maybe even 1 square kilometer, I'm not actually sure. And so that's one nice thing to strive for, because if we had cleaner, better data, we'd be able to much more easily do better research.
I'll also just add that there are other states in the United States that have buffer zones. We've been looking at that for a while. I think California, the quarter-mile road schools is the strongest, but there are other states that have been looking at buffer zones, different types of buffer zones for different, either specific pesticides or different types of applications.
Okay, the next question is, perhaps this is a question for Sani. Will there ever be studies on a combination of multiple chemicals to see how they interact? Why are they not done? My understanding is the Food Quality Protection Act actually required the study of the interactions between multiple compounds, but is that actually being done?
It's a hard problem. I mean, one of my dissertation papers did attempt to do this in a mechanism of action sort of way. So I was looking at endocrine disrupting pesticide action, PCBs. And so I tried to group, which ones have estrogenic effects or anti-estrogenic effects, or at least try to look at the mode of potential operation and interference in the endocrine system. And it is just a really hard problem. That's why you don't know necessarily if a particular chemical is going to be synergistic with another or if it's going to counteract another. And so it's a fundamental problem of exposure assessment.
And I think it's also there's so many, right? So it would take so long. So each mixture has to be studied for years and years and years. But then there's an unknown amount of different mixtures. And how would you ever, then when you have 3, then okay, what do the 3 do together? It's just like mixing drugs. You don't mix drugs and then, you don't take this with this, or you don't drink alcohol when you take this. But then a lot of that takes a long time to learn. It'll take years and years and years to study each combination.
And by the way, it's not just pesticides we're talking about, right? Talking about,
PFAS and PBDs and like all of the thing, all this soup that we're exposed to, and that pretty much all of us have in our bodies at any given time.
So the next question has to do with fumigants. So as mentioned repeatedly that fumigation is one of the highest application rates. So this has to do with agriculture. Why are fumigants being used? What function do these fumigants serve, and what might be some possible solutions to reduce the amount of fumigants that are used?
Great question. Fumigants are used to sterilize soil. The concept is like we're going to kill the bad pathogens that might bring disease to our plants and worms, nematodes, worm family. It goes against the whole fundamental concept of like a bottom-up approach of building the health of soil up, right? And actually, you want to put more life in your soil. You want to put the good life in your soil because the good life manages the bad life in the soil, whether that's microbes or worms. So it's the fundamental concept is stopping the monoculture agriculture style. First of all, moving away from this, we have to plant thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of one thing because naturally in the natural world, like I have an ecology degree, so my passion really like in biodiversity, the assemblage of species is like the more species that you have, the more resilient and the more a strong community of an ecosystem is going to be. So creating that mindset of moving us away from this agricultural model that requires the poisoning and sterilization of soil, which doesn't really require it, but it's like this dependency thing of like we're going to kill everything and then plant these pads because then they won't get disease. That's the thought behind it, but in actuality, we're making the soil less alive and less productive, and we're kind of working against ourselves. So I think changing the fundamental way that we farm is a huge part of it. And then there may be like solutions in the meantime, so it could help us transition away from this use. I'm not 100% sure about what this 30,000 pounds of metasodium is being used on by Sugarland. So I'm not sure which specific crops that is, but definitely the pineapple. Definitely, looking at how we're raising mass grower crops of pineapple, I think is the start. I think that answers.
So this next question has to do with some of the terms that were introduced at the beginning. It was mentioned that pesticide formulations and the application rates are based on the active ingredient. Could you tell us a little bit more about, is the active ingredient the majority of materials, and are there other components in a pesticide formulation that are also potentially toxic?
I would say that there are a lot of ingredients in some pesticides, and some are applied as a dust or pellet, and some are applied as a liquid, and stuff. It's going to depend probably on which pesticide you're talking about as to what the other ingredients are. If they're listed as an active, and there can be pesticides, formulations that have multiple active ingredients in them. So yes, anything that is listed as an active ingredient is likely going to have, potential about effect. But if it's an inactive ingredient, an inert ingredient, I don't think that too many people study those. I don't really know, actually.
A lot of the inert ingredients are petrochemical based as well. So there's a lot of, it's hard to know, but sometimes it's a very small percentage of the active ingredient. And then there's like all these other either surfactants, like soap is the easiest way to explain a surfactant, right? So surfactants that help it stick to something or is doing something to make it either stay on the plant or the soil or an emulsifier. And sometimes those individual compounds can be incredibly toxic too. And what we learned on Maui, our Hawaii, was that, and it was actually by chance, like we had like this inspector in the field and they were like walking around in the Syngenta field and they found this bottle that somebody had like thrown out of the back of one of the spray trucks. And it was called Big Bubble. You're laughing because you remember the Big Bubble. And it was like this mind-blowing, like ball drop moment where we realized they were also adding a masking agent so that it smelled like candy when it drifted through the school. There's no idea what the study, there's no idea what the impact would be of mixing this
big bubble with the pesticide so that doesn't cause alarm. So that when you start to smell this sweet smell that smells like bubble gum, there's it doesn't bring up a concern. You're not concerned because it smells sweet like bubble gum. That was just this other just monumental moment for us where we were saying, oh.
So the next question has to do with the idea of buffer zones, and my understanding is that the literature supports the claim that if you live within or work within a 1 mile radius of where organophosphates are regularly used, the risk of exposure and some kind of cognitive development disorder goes up significantly. But it sounds like the conversation around buffer zones is actually less than a 1 mile radius. So any comments on, are we actually developing policy proposals that are reflective of the scientific implications of the findings?
That's just another case of the political process not necessarily following the science, I think. And the problem with public health studies and health effects studies in general, epidemiological studies, is that you cannot ever prove causation. And so there's always, if you look at some of even the EPA documents, I think it was around pyrethroids that I was looking at, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of articles that are cited, and they summarize each kind of health effect, and at the end they say, there is insufficient evidence. Even if, there were 8 studies and 7 of them found a significant finding, they always deem pretty much all epidemiological studies as of low quality, or maybe moderate quality. And so I think getting any buffer zones is going to be a lot better than buffer zones.
I think in this case, unfortunately in pollution chemistry, I'm aware that the way that they treat a lot of this is dilution is the solution to pollution. And is mind screwing as that was for me in my younger years as an environmental scientist going to university and just being like, what? Dilution is not the solution. The solution is stop polluting. Not dilute the pollution. I mean, this is just, how did we get here, But I think part of the buffer zone argument and is just that we're trying to dilute what hits somebody, like the concentration. It's how much, and I think up to 7 miles for verifos, how it was found on air samples up to 7 miles away from the nearest known application, possible impact up to 7 miles. How far can we buffer? And I'll never forget in the Battle of 2491, in front of the Council chambers, marathon hearings, families crying, mothers coming out begging for the council to pass me so that their kids know that they'll be begging because they're scared for the health and safety of their unborn child. And then people begging for jobs from the corporations and then these chemical company leads that I'll never forget, the head of the Hawaiʻi Crop Improvement Association at the time, getting up and saying, the buffer zones will protect you. I actually made a video of it, and I just repeated it, saying, the buffer zones will protect you, And I think unfortunately, the reality is that it's a level of protection. Is it complete protection? No, it's not going to be complete protection. It depends on a lot of other things. Regulation is another really important part with the buffer zones, because on the back of these labels, and you'll hear the corporations constantly tell you, the label is the law, the label is the law. And on the back of the label, there's all these specifications. Can it apply when winds are over 5 miles an hour? Can it apply within 24 hours of rain? How are you ever going to do that there's certain, and I think there's all kinds of violations with these restricted use pesticides that are probably happening every single day. And there's no enforcement, there's no oversight, there's no way to know. We don't know what they're spraying, when they're spraying it, and we don't know how to go out and check. Are the winds, you applied this on a day where the winds were 25 miles an hour? Well, that stuff went a lot farther than if you applied that stuff when the winds were under 5 miles an hour, when you were supposed to, when the label says that you're supposed to. So I think it's a combination of it is a protective mechanism, but in the famous words of Kirby Kester, the buffer zones will protect you. Sorry.
So this last question here is, you've touched on it, but how can we get private landowners to use less pesticides and harmful chemicals on their property so it doesn't enter your stream or expose people to potential harmful toxicants?
Okay, I said it's beat, so. Transforming agriculture, which I talked about, supporting farmers. I think there's a lot to be said about
working with the farmers to understand and pick apart this 100-year-old, dogma that we've been told we're dependent upon these chemicals inputs. That's a big part of it. I think moving it away legislatively, having a new administration under Governor Green's appointed, people in our government, in the Department of Agriculture that care enough to be here today. And I think that's a huge, huge thing, is that like for the last over 10 years, I have been, pleading with the permits to help us. I've never had a response like I've had, and that really is huge for us, and I think, supporting the transition away. Actually, will you repeat the question? There was a part of it that was figure revenue or something else.
What was the question?
Exactly.
So how can we get private landowners to reduce pesticide?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think it is like working collaboratively, like for private landowners, obviously the regulations around stuff like that, and education. I think the big thing for like private individual landowners is education. People don't understand, like my generation, like I was born at the end of the aerial test strips for Agent Orange on Kauai, where Agent Orange was tested before it was brought to Vietnam. And so I kind of made this full circle revelation when I was home from university, like, and I decided that this was my life's work. I was like, whoa, like this is actually bigger than me. Like I was born here, but right there across the ridge, Bulled-Up was defoliated to test Agent Orange, Agent White, Agent Pink, Agent Blue, all these chemicals, right? And they just defoliated everything. And then they decided, oh, Agent Orange worked really good. We're going to take it to Vietnam and we're going to defoliate an entire country and create 3 or 4 generations of mutations. But that experimentation happened here in Hawaii. I come from a generation that, my school was evacuated. We weren't even evacuated. They sprayed over our school in Kincaid. I was like first year, I think it's the first grade or so. It must have been second grade, because I actually remember my dad being like really upset about how the helicopters flew right over our school and never shut the sprayers off. It was like, I don't know what I was. But we come from a generation that's a lot more complacent, and education, fragging our brain from this whole chemical dependency in the last 100 years of what we've been sold requires a lot of education. We're from the generation where, our parents thought you could drink Roundup, like there's that whole thing, you could drink it, it's so safe you can drink. Well, look at us now, not safe enough to drink, right? So I think we have to work on education, outreach, support. Like, I think a big part of it is like not targeting people and not making people feel like, oh, you use this, or like you're a bad person, like you're poisoning people. Like I think we need to kind of move away from this pointing fingers, good, bad, and we have to look at the way that we have been educated or uneducated and coerced by chemical corporations to believe that we need their products. And remember, they make money by selling you their pesticides. So this is not like a philanthropy, like good, like we're here to help you get rid of the weeds. Like, no, we're here to make billions and billions of dollars and not care about the collateral damage. And I think that education, along with support, along with private landowners being supported and even incentivized. So, right, so we subsidize more to produce the corn than we buy it for. That's a major problem. We need to flip those kind of things on everybody from private landowners and management to like full-scale agricultural systems and be like, no, we're going to subsidize you if you don't poison your neighbors. We're going to, subsidize you if you're not poisoning the waterways, rather than this whole. Yeah, a lot of it just comes down to mass production, industrialized agriculture, and this whole follow. And so education, legislation, and support.
I was going to add to that. These are the kinds of conversations that lead to change. And it just, it is education, but community involvement leads to change. I'd say speaking with your wallet leads to change.
Voting your dollar.
Voting and your wallet. And so if you elect to buy more organic and support regenerative farming practices, you are speaking pretty loudly.
And I wanted to add to the education. So when, people start to see the impact directly, so like a Molokaʻi, the deer sometimes get to the corn and then they'll eat it. And we, on Molokaʻi, we still have a lot of subsistence gathering and we eat off the land. And so we have the deer. And it's very clear when a deer was eating Monsanto's corn. There's a smell to it, there's a look to it, and eat ulcers. It's just, and so I think like that also helps to connect the dots for people when they see the insides of another animal and what it, the impact that it's having on its, internal workings. Because, we don't see the insides of each other and how pesticides may be impacting us, but when you kill a deer and, you just see that the meat is not something that you want to consume.
Thanks for that. Wait, it's actually a really good point, because a lot of the GE corn that's grown, kind of like the paraquat wing that's experimented on in Hawaii, but then the parent seed that gets exported to places like the Midwest and grown at scale. A lot of it is grown for feed, animal feed. So it's really, it's not surprising that we have really a lot of glyphosate in our bodies. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask our panelists, is there any question that you would have liked to have been asked? Is there any other closing thoughts? I'm going to respond. There's a question about what happened to the 2023 legislative bills on pesticides. I think Fern, you kind of touched on that already with the fact that some of them are still alive and you can support them this session. They didn't make it last session, but you can definitely get involved. You have a QR code on the back of that flyer if you want to sign up to legislative alerts. But I'd love to just hear any closing thoughts from our panelists on, if there was a question we didn't get to ask or any kind of closing thoughts you'd like to rock off with.
My closing thoughts are, first of all, to thank everybody for being here, for supporting this sort of work and learning more about pesticide and health in Hawaii. I think, there has not been a lot of research in pesticides in Hawaii in decades. And so I think it's time to look at, we have a different composition of our population here. We have questions that can be asked and answered in our population. So it's wonderful to have this sort of support and to hopefully be able to develop relationships with communities to help us answer some of these questions.
Yeah, no question I'm dying to be asked to. I would say closing, this has really kind of become my life's work. I never expected it to. I went to school for actually marine biology because I was going to save the whales. And then things changed as I started to do more ecological research and I became an ecologist. And then I learned this work and I kind of fell into this place where somehow this has become, for the last 15 years, what I ended up doing. And I am grateful and incredibly amazed constantly. And sometimes I get inspired by how we're finally getting somewhere. Had an incredible meeting with the DOA last week. That was the most perceptive and positive meeting I've had with any environmental agency for the last 10 years. I'm seeing, a growing body of evidence, a growing body of people being concerned and care, and I'm really, I feel honored to work in this space and to be able to, share this. And I'm an open book. You guys can reach out to me at any time. My contact details are all available on our website, hapahai.org. I would encourage people to continue to dive into and question some of what you heard here today. I would encourage you to go on and be like, I don't know, I would never look at it myself, because I think it's a growing process. It's taken me 15 years to get to the point where I kind of have this knowledge in my head, but we're all on this journey together. And the more that we all know, and the more that we all understand this together, the farther we're going to get. I would encourage people to go watch the documentary Poisoning Paradise. It actually features quite a bit of Sadi's work and shows some of the actual maps of the brain impacts that we saw for pyrophos specifically. I would encourage people to watch Into the Weeds, which dives into that glyphosate court case, to look up and research some of these avenues and areas and to continue to educate in your community. And, I guess my ask of all of you is to step forward and to be involved, be involved this legislative session. You can sign up for mail alerts from us, but there's many organizations that are doing great work in agriculture and just coming to the table and helping us. It's going to be an all hands on deck. And again,
we are fighting the largest chemical corporations on the planet to get you this information. You know, we have individually been targeted, attacked, broken down, discredited, blocked about. You know, me and my friends in this room have been, you know, torn apart over the years for holding this line. And so, you know, I ask you to come to the table and like ask us questions, talk to us, and be, you know, be open about it. Have these hard conversations. Like, how do we transform agriculture in Hawaii? How do we feed our people without collateral damage that are our kids? You know, and so I would just ask for your engagement and your involvement, and to come, you know, alongside us, and let's do this.
Yeah. It's it now.
So I'll echo, you know, all of that, and mahalo to all of you for being here today, for everyone watching online and the, you know, recording later. You know, I think it also kind of triggered me earlier when you were triggered, just kind of recounting and remembering and recalling and describing all that trauma during that time, because our community is still kind of healing from that time. There is a lot of division, and so just thinking about that as a, you know, we talk about environmental impacts, but you know, some of the social impacts, you know, the social fabric. I want to quote Lahina Paishan, you know, in a previous meeting, she said, you know, whatever the problem, community is the answer. But it takes a lot of work to keep a community together. And when this battle took place, it was really destructive to our community specifically, and Kauai, and Maui. A lot of people were demonized on both sides. It divided families, friends. I think some friends and families are you know, finally coming back together, but it took years. So I think that there's you know, a handful of people were really involved on either side, but the majority of people are not really informed, and they kind of are on the outside. And so I think any little bit of education and involvement and engagement that can happen is helpful, because every voice matters, every vote counts. We're entering into another election year. You know, all the House of Representatives are up for re-election. You know, a lot of the council members, half, I think, of the senators. And so, you know, for everyone out there, you know, just stay informed about, you know, how people are voting, how your representatives, how your senators are voting, and, you know, ask them the hard questions and make sure that your interests is being represented by them at the Capitol.
Thank you to all of our panelists for their wonderful Manoa insights on this topic. I really appreciate, Keani, that you just raised that, you know, the social impacts as well. I think it's very typical for large kind of extractive industries to use. There is somewhat of a playbook of a divide and conquer, and it's real. And so I just thank you, amazing women, for staying the course through all of those ups and downs, for signing for your research, which really bolstered us at a time when we needed it. And yeah, we leaned on it heavily. And I know a lot of people who are.
I was just going to say, it was, I find not my research, there is an enormous team of folks over the last 20 years who have done such great work.
Wow. Well, that body of research was really critical, I think. So I just want to thank all of you for joining the conversation and sharing with us tonight. I really want to thank our hosts at Hawaii for being always creating such a warm, multiple spaces Always opening their doors to these kinds of conversations, and Keani for always being so just wonderful to work with. Again, thank Dr. Miles and the UHS Oʻahu team. Thank you to the Department of Ag for being here as well, and for Rep. Puriso and all of her willingness to champion common sense pesticide regulation bills, and to all of you for being here tonight. And Senator Richard's staff, thank you for being here too. They reached out to some of our lawmakers to invite them to attend, so it really means a lot to have you here in the room with us. So I think with that, we're pretty ready to wrap it up, but please, I wanted to just encourage us. We ordered way too much food. But we wanted to feed you all because it's dinner time. So please, there's takeout containers. Please load up on those, really bring home to your ohana. And just thank you all for coming out. I know it's close to the holidays, and thanks for taking the time to be here.